Welcome to History Forum. I'm your host, Dr. Jacob Roram. In this program, we're featuring Matthew Delmont, author of Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. Delmont focuses on black military heroes, the battles they faced across the sea, and the racism that persisted upon their return home. We are glad to welcome him to History Forum. For over 20 years, History Forum has brought the best U.S. history scholars to St. Paul to share award-winning books and cutting-edge historical research. Each talk may illuminate a history you've never heard before, or bring a new perspective on a familiar topic. But regardless, each program will give you a deeper and more complex understanding of the past and your relationship to it. Enjoy the program.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out today. Hearing the buzz in the audience as people were sitting down was really enriching. I can tell you all love history, and so I know I'm in good company. You're folks who love history just like I do. As Jacob mentioned, this is a homecoming for me, and so since I'm back in Minnesota, I have to start with a picture. This is me at Martin Luther King Park, 1987. I'm second from the left. I grew up downtown Minneapolis, 13th and Nicollet Towers. Played sports at Martin Luther King Park, and then at Lyndhurst Park. Went to Burroughs Elementary in southwest Minneapolis. My family moved out to Bloomington, West Bloomington, for high school, and I got a scholarship to go to St. Thomas Academy. And as I was walking over here from the hotel, I saw the cathedral, which is where I graduated in 1996. So it's really great to have a chance to be home. Yeah, Minnesota definitely deserves some applause there. Since this book came out in October 2022, I've had a chance to give more than 100 different lectures. It's my first time being back in Minnesota, so I really appreciate the chance to talk about the book. I want to start by telling you a couple of things. The first is that we can't understand American history without understanding African American history. My hope today is that my presentation will give you new insights into what World War II looked like and really hopefully change your understanding about the war. By focusing on the experiences of black men and women, hopefully it'll change your understanding of the war. I also want to tell you something I tell my students in the classroom all the time, which is that the stories we tell about the past matter. These stories are vitally important to understanding not just the history of World War II, but how the country came out of the war, understanding the history of civil rights, and really understanding how the country is structured today. This is a challenging presentation. A lot of what I present today is going to be inspiring, some tremendous stories of service and patriotism. But there are also stories that are really upsetting, stories about racism and discrimination. And so I'd ask you to hang in there. Right? This is our shared history, and it's important that we embrace it together so we can learn from it, reckon honestly with it, and hopefully move in better directions into the future. I want to start by telling you where the project came from. So I appreciate Jacob mentioning black newspapers, because this project, Half American, grew out of my last book project, which was a project called Black Quotidian, Everyday History in African American Newspapers. You can actually find it for free online at blackquotidian.org. It's only a digital project, but it was published by Stanford University Press. For this project, I was looking at different historical black newspapers at different points in time over the 20th century, papers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier, to try to get a sense of how different communities were experiencing history as it unfolded. In the course of doing that research, I came across dozens of images that looked like this. This is from the Minneapolis Spokesman, so shout out to Twin Cities again. Minneapolis Spokesman was the largest and most important black newspaper in the Twin Cities. These weren't famous people. But in the course of doing the research on Black Quotidian, I kept coming across these images of black men and women in the service of their country during World War II. And I was surprised by these. I'm a professor, I'm a historian, I've taught about this topic in the classroom for more than a decade, but I'd never seen this many examples of black men and women in uniform during World War II. And so it made me curious. I wanted to know what more there was to the story. What wasn't I sharing with my students? What stories weren't in our textbooks? And so that was about 7 years ago. It was that curiosity that led me to the research that resulted in Half American. And I should mention, since I'm here, Minneapolis Spokesman, as Jacob mentioned, digitized by the Minnesota Historical Society. It's part of a larger project called Chronicling America that the Library of Congress and National Endowment for Humanities have created. Tremendously valuable resources, and I encourage you to check them out if you haven't already. One of the things I came across was a letter written by a man named James G. Thompson. In late December 1941, James Thompson writes this remarkable letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the nation's largest and most influential black newspaper at the time. His letter asks a series of very pressing and pointed questions. He asked in part, should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Is the America I know worth defending? And that phrase, should I sacrifice my life to live half American, it stuck with me. That's why I chose Half American as the title of the book. What Thompson was asking is, what does it mean to be asked to fight for, potentially die for a country that treats you as a second-class citizen? It was a question that was on the minds of a lot of other black Americans at the time. This is after Pearl Harbor, so late December 1941. He knows that he and other black Americans are about to be drafted into a segregated military. The great historian Stephen Ambrose has said that the great irony of World War II is that you had the world's largest democracy in the United States fighting against the world's worst racist, Adolf Hitler, with a segregated army. That irony wasn't lost on men and women like James Thompson. They recognized the hypocrisy of being asked to fight for freedom and democracy when they didn't enjoy freedom and democracy here in the United States. The Pittsburgh Courier used Thompson's letter to launch what was called the Double Victory Campaign that became the rallying cry for black Americans during the war. Double victory stood for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. It's important to understand it wasn't just a clever slogan or rhetorical device. It really was how black Americans understood the war. They were absolutely committed to military victory. They knew that the United States had to do everything they could to help defeat Germany and the Axis powers. But they also recognized that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to defeat this kind of hatred on foreign battlefields and come home to that same kind of hatred here in the United States. And so throughout World War II, it was a two-front battle. The war fronts abroad and the battles here at home. I've structured my presentation today around the three key arguments the book makes. The first is that we have to start the story before Pearl Harbor. It's fortuitous that today is December 7th, because this is traditionally the starting point for when Americans talk about the story of World War II. There's a lot of good reasons for that, but it's wrong. When you look at black newspapers from the 1930s, you see extensive coverage of the rise of fascism in Europe, and that's where I want to start the story. This is the Norfolk Journal and Guide, April 1933, an article written by a famous black sociologist named Kelly Miller, making direct connections between Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime and the Ku Klux Klan, the terrorist organization that threatened and in some cases murdered black Americans here in the United States. Black Americans were among the first to recognize the really serious threat that Hitler posed because they understood that he was explicitly drawing on American racial policies to help justify his treatment of Jews in Europe. And so every time a new policy was passed in Germany, the segregation of Jews on train cars, theft of Jewish property, violence against Jewish communities, all of that showed up in the black press, and it outraged black Americans. They recognized this wasn't a problem that was just going to be confined to Europe. This was an international problem, because they recognized they were experiencing a lot of the same kind of treatment here in the United States. Moving ahead a couple years, when the Spanish Civil War starts in 1936, that too galvanizes black Americans all over the country. This is a headline from the Chicago Defender in 1936 saying that the Second World War had started as El Duce, that's Mussolini, and Hitler are aiding Franco and the fascists in Spain. There's a group of Americans that volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, to fight against fascism. There are about 3,000 Americans who went there. They're collectively called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Of those, there were 80 black Americans who went to Spain. Langston Hughes, the famous poet and author, was fascinated by this. He wants to understand, what does it mean for these average black Americans, people from Cleveland, from Chicago, from Alabama, to uproot their lives, travel to a country they'd never been to before to fight against fascism? So he became a war correspondent for the Baltimore African American, and then he travels to Spain, and he's on the front lines reporting on these black volunteers. And I'll highlight some of the people he wrote about. He wrote about Thaddeus Battle, who was a young man who was a Howard University student who dropped out of Howard University, paused his studies to go fight in the Spanish Civil War. Battle's parents were librarians, and he said that the thing that upset him most about what was going on in Spain was the destruction of schools and libraries, seeing the fascist forces destroy books. That's part of what motivated him to fight. James Bunny Rucker was a 25-year-old son of a Christian minister from Columbus, Ohio. Both Battle and Rucker were doing everyday things, doing construction work. Sorry, Rucker was doing construction work in Columbus, Ohio in the summer before he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Battle and Rucker went on to serve in the US Army during World War II. He was also profiled the only black woman to serve in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, a woman named Celeria Key. She was a 23-year-old from Akron, Ohio. Key was a nurse. She tried to volunteer for the American Red Cross to go serve in Spain, but they turned her away. They said the color of her skin made it more trouble than it was worth. so she volunteered for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade instead. When Hughes caught up with her, he asked her, what motivated you to come here? She said it was really two things. The first, that she was a Catholic. And even though she didn't consider herself particularly political, she thought it was her obligation to help people in need. And so when she heard about peasant communities in Spain being bombed, she knew she had to do something about it. The second thing she said is that she was doing her nurse training in New York at Harlem Hospital, and she was working alongside a number of Jewish doctors. And they described the atrocities of the Nazi regime. And that too motivated her to fight against fascism. And so years before Pearl Harbor, you already have hundreds of Americans, including 80 black Americans, who've chosen to uproot their lives to go fight against fascism in Spain. Langston Hughes is writing their stories, and those stories are being publicized all across the United States. And so this is something that average black people across the country were talking about in 1937, 1938. Solaria Key, like Battle and Rucker, went on to serve in the US Army during World War II. So there's a lot of continuities between those who served in Spain and those who went to serve in the war itself. On the home front, one of the key stories was the March on Washington movement, led by A. Philip Randolph. Randolph was one of the most powerful black men in the country in 1941. He was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest black union in the country. Before the United States officially enters World War II, President Roosevelt has made a commitment that the United States will be the arsenal of democracy, that it will provide supplies, tanks, trucks, bullets, bombs to the allies that are getting ready to fight in the war. That means jobs all across the country as factories get converted to defense industries. Initially, black Americans were blocked from those jobs. And so Randolph organized to try to do something about that. He threatened to lead 100,000 black Americans to march on Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1941 unless President Roosevelt agreed to desegregate the defense industries. It was a tremendous threat. No one had ever done anything like this at the time. Through a series of high-stakes backroom negotiations, President Roosevelt agrees to sign an executive order that, at least on paper, desegregates those defense industries in exchange for Randolph calling off this March on Washington. But it does two important things. First, it helps to demonstrate black political power. Just the fact that Randolph can persuasively threaten to do this, it can actually get the ear of the president and force him to action, sends shockwaves all across the country. Black people had been fighting for civil rights for decades, but seeing how powerful these organized collective efforts could be really marked a new chapter in the fight for black freedom. And even though this march was called off in the summer of 1941, it lays the foundation for what becomes the March on Washington in 1963. By that point, Randolph is the grandfather of the movement, but the same idea leads to the March on Washington in 1963. So all of that's happening before 1941. So the first argument is that we have to think about that decade prior to 1941 to really understand how black Americans were thinking about the lead up to the war. The second argument is that we have to take the double victory campaign seriously. And so throughout the book, I thread together the military battlefields with the battles on the home front, because that's how people experienced the war as it was unfolding. On the military side, perhaps the most well-known individual black American to serve in the war was Doris Miller. He was a young mess attendant on the USS West Virginia. And taking a step back, I mentioned at the outset that the military is racially segregated during World War II. In the Navy, black men can only serve as mess attendants, which is the lowest rank on the ship. They do all the cooking and cleaning and essentially serve white officers. So that was Doris Miller's job. Nevertheless, once the bombing of Pearl Harbor happens, he performs heroically. He goes above deck and helps attend to the wounds of injured shipmates. Then, when his lieutenant orders him to go to one of the anti-aircraft guns, he goes over there and starts firing at the Japanese planes that are circling overhead, potentially hitting and downing one of them. It was a remarkable story because he had no training on the ship's weapons. The story resonated powerfully for black people across the country because they understood that between World War I and World War II, military leaders had done almost everything they could to push black Americans out of military service. They said black people didn't have the courage, the bravery, the intelligence to be able to be good soldiers. And so they're saying, look, if you just give us the opportunity, we have the ability to help defend our country. Let us do this. My favorite thing about being a historian is that you learn so much in the course of doing research. So Julius Ellsbury is a name that I didn't know when I started this project 7 years ago. But Doris Miller wasn't the only black mess attendant at Pearl Harbor. There were dozens of others, including Julius Ellsbury, who was a 20-year-old mess attendant on the USS Oklahoma. Like Miller, he performed heroically on that morning. He tried to help his shipmates who had been wounded in the attack. But unlike Miller, he lost his life in the battle. He was the first person, black or white, to be killed in World War II from Birmingham, Alabama. And this picture with the phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was posted everywhere in Black Birmingham in the weeks after the attack. And so these are the names that Black Americans were talking about in the early months of 1942. They're talking about Doris Miller, talking about Julius Ellsbury, and talking about the desire Black people had to help defend the country. This is the headline of the Chicago Defender just days after the Pearl Harbor attack. The headline says, "Awake, white America, the hour is at hand." The editors wrote, "White America must learn now that a Negro in the armed service of his country, in the uniform of his government, must be respected as a defender of democracy." Further down on the page, the Defender reported on 3 young Black Chicagoans who tried to register for military service but were turned away. And there were hundreds of Black Americans who did the same thing. Just like white Americans, they went to volunteer for the Army or Navy in those days after Pearl Harbor. But there were hundreds of Black Americans who were turned away. Because at that point, the Army and the Navy didn't yet have enough all-Black units to accommodate them. And these young men, like the others who were turned away, were left dumbfounded. They asked, what's wrong with our citizenship? What's wrong with our patriotism? What's wrong with our desire to serve our country that we're being turned away in this way? And so this is also part of the story of how Black Americans understood that period after Pearl Harbor. It might seem paradoxical, but one of the first things Black people had to do was fight for the opportunity to fight. Initially, military leaders didn't want Black Americans to be able to serve their country in the war, certainly not at the rate or percentage that Black Americans desired to do so. On the civil rights side, 2 of the figures I talk about are Thurgood Marshall and Ella Baker. Thurgood Marshall is, of course, best known as the first Black Supreme Court justice, but during the war, he was the head of the legal division for the NAACP. And so he traveled all across the country investigating cases of violence against Black troops who were training on military bases. One of the sources I relied on for the book were hundreds and hundreds of letters written by Black troops to the NAACP seeking help. These were troops stationed on military bases primarily in the South, in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, who described absolutely harrowing conditions. They described violence on base and off base, being threatened, in some cases beaten, in some cases shot, while in the service of their country, in their military uniforms. They said they would feel safer once they deployed to the European theater or the Pacific theater than they did training for the war here in the United States. There's sometimes a story we tell ourselves about World War II that it was a better time, a more unified time. That's true in parts, but it's not true overall. When you actually look at the reality of how Black Americans experienced World War II, it was a very fraught, frustrated, discriminatory time, including for young men and women who were in the service of their country. So part of what Thurgood Marshall did was help to make sure these cases were brought to justice. He did everything he could to help make sure Black troops were not being harassed and attacked while in the service of their country. Ella Baker was a tremendously important grassroots activist. You might know her from the 1960s for her work with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But during World War II, she was the head of branch membership for the NAACP, and she was wildly successful at her job. She helped to travel across the country, organizing local people to fight for their rights. You can see by the numbers on the screen how much the NAACP increased in terms of membership and chapters over the course of their war. Historians like myself sometimes talk about World War II as a turning point for civil rights. And part of what we mean by that is that the infrastructure of civil rights got built out over the course of the war. The fact that the NAACP was so much larger in 1945 meant that they had more dues-paying members, so that they had money to be able to fight larger, more complex civil rights cases like Brown versus Board. One of Baker's big innovations that she recognized, you didn't have to be a professional class Black person to be a leader. You didn't have to be a doctor or a lawyer. You could be a domestic worker or a sharecropper and still be a leader in your community. And so one of the things she did was to help to hold leadership training workshops, particularly in the South. I'll mention it later, but she held a training workshop in Atlanta in 1945 that Rosa Parks attended, fully a decade before the Montgomery bus boycott. So Baker helped to organize people all across the country to help fight for civil rights in the decades after World War II. To give you a sense of what they're fighting against, this is a headline from a race riot in Beaumont, Texas, in the summer of 1943. In 1943 alone, there were more than 240 race riots and racial clashes in big cities and small towns and military bases, including this one in Beaumont, Texas that I want to highlight. So on June 15th, 1943, a false rumor circulated in Beaumont that 2 white women had been raped by Black men. A crowd of approximately 4,000 people armed with hammers, axes, and guns, descended on the city's black neighborhoods. The mob looted and burned homes and businesses, and they assaulted many black people. 2 people were killed, and a third died later from wounds sustained during the riot. One commander of the Texas State Guard compared the condition of the city to the destruction he had seen in a World War I battle zone. The city's black neighborhoods, he said, had been literally stomped into the ground. The picture here from the Baltimore African American is an American flag that flew outside of a black business in Beaumont. This was a business owner who had sold thousands of dollars of war bonds. But the American flag had been burned alongside the man's business. And so one of the things that the editors asked in this story, and what people in Texas were asking is, again, what's wrong with our patriotism? We're trying to help the United States win this war, yet we're being attacked here in our hometown. Langston Hughes kept writing during World War II. And so I want to read to you from a poem he wrote about this summer of violence in 1943, called From Beaumont to Detroit. Detroit was another site of one of the major race riots during this time. Hughes wrote, "Looky here, America, what you done. Let things drift until the riots come. Now your policemen let your mobs run free. I reckon you don't care nothing about me. You tell me that Hitler is a mighty bad man. I guess he took his lessons from the Ku Klux Klan. You tell me Mussolini's got an evil heart. Well, it must have been in Beaumont that he got his start. Because everything that Hitler and Mussolini do, Negroes get the same treatment from you. You Jim Crowed me before Hitler rose to power, and you're still Jim Crowing me right now, this very hour. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy. Then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow." So as Hughes so often did, he cut to the chase. Right? One of the things I love about this poem is that this is what double victory sounded like in 1943. Again, black people are absolutely committed to helping to win the war. They recognize how dangerous Hitler and the Nazis are. But they also don't want to be treated like this in the United States. They don't want their communities, their businesses, their homes burned. Right? It's not an unreasonable request, but this is part of what motivated the double victory campaign. Back to the military battlefields, June 6, 1944, perhaps the most important and most iconic battle from the American perspective of World War II, the D-Day invasion. There were about 2,000 black troops that were part of the D-Day invasion on June 6th, including a barrage balloon battalion. So if you look at pictures of the Channel crossing and you see these kind of funny-shaped balloons, those were called barrage balloons. And they were tethered to the ships by long cables, and they dangled other cables that had mines attached to them. The goals of those balloons was to make it more difficult, if not impossible, for German planes to drop low enough to be able to strafe the ships as they're crossing the channel, or to be able to strafe the troops as they got to the shore. But when you see pictures of those balloons, know that they were manned by a black unit, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. One of the men in that unit performed heroically on D-Day. He was a combat medic named Waverly Woodson. He was wounded as his ship was coming to shore, but nevertheless, he set up a medical aid station on the beach, and over the next 30 hours, tended the wounds of more than 240 men. He helped to rescue men from drowning, he helped to do amputations, save the lives of dozens and dozens of men. Woodson's commander recommended him for the Medal of Honor, but it wasn't awarded. During the war, there were 443 Medals of Honor awarded. None were awarded to black troops. I'll mention later, thankfully, in the 1990s, 7 black men were promoted from the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. Woodson was part of that story. D-Day, of course, just stood for Day of the Invasion. There was still D-Day +1, D-Day +2, and it was the weeks and months after June 6th that really turned the tide of the war for the Allies. Black troops were absolutely vital to that part of the war because they were the backbone of the American supply effort. So the group I'll highlight here is a group called the Red Ball Express, a truck convoy driven primarily by black truck drivers. These black truck drivers moved 400,000 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel in the weeks and months after D-Day. It's what made it possible for America and the Allies to push as quickly across France as they did, and eventually into Germany. The American supply infrastructure was much more advanced and dynamic than the German infrastructure was. Almost everything the Allies moved to the front passed through the hands of at least one black American. Without these black supply troops, the American and Allied supply effort would have ground to a halt. And this was recognized at the time. Langston Hughes wasn't the only black war correspondent. There were about a dozen others, including Ollie Stewart. He wrote this about the miracle of supply. He said, although port battalions and work troops are not generally regarded on par with frontline combat troops, it is a matter of record that no group of soldiers in this theater has done more to make possible Allied victory. They liberate no towns, see no flags, drink no champagne, nor kiss happy girls. Yet when things become critical, the first cry of high command is, give us more supplies. So one of the arguments the book makes is that World War II wasn't just a battle of strategy and will, it was a battle of supply. And when you understand the war from that perspective, the vital role that black troops played becomes all the more apparent. And a similar thing was true on the home front. There were about 1 million black Americans that worked in the defense industries, including 600,000 black women, including the 4 pictured here at a shipbuilding facility in Richmond, California. These were incredibly important jobs for black women to have access to during the war, because prior to the war, this kind of factor was entirely off limits. Black women were primarily working either in the home or as domestic workers or in fields. And so the fact that they could get these kind of jobs and the pay that went with them was tremendously important. One of those black war workers was Rosa Parks. She worked as a civilian seamstress at Maxwell Air Base in Montgomery, Alabama. One of the stories she told about the war was that on the base, by 1944, the buses were integrated. And so she could sit wherever she wanted to on the buses at Maxwell Air Base. But when they got to the city limits and she transferred to the Montgomery city bus, then she had to sit in the back of the bus. She described that one block transfer going from, she felt like it was going from being a first-class citizen to being a second-class citizen. I mentioned earlier, Rosa Parks attended one of the leadership training workshops that Ella Baker ran, and so it helped to prepare her for the kind of activist she became in the 1950s. Parks' brother Sylvester also served in the Army during World War II. He was in the Pacific Theater. But when he came home, he couldn't get a mortgage and couldn't get a job. And so all of this motivated Parks to fight for civil rights in the 1950s. She later said, I'd always been taught that this was America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. I felt that it should be actual in action rather than just something that we hear and talk about. The largest unit of black women to serve in the war was the 6th 888 Central Postally Directed Battalion under the command of Major Charity Adams. They deployed to the European theater in late 1944, and their job was to distribute mail all across the European theater. That might sound like an easy thing to do, but it was actually incredibly complicated because these units were moving constantly, and you had lots of people with common names like John Williams or Mark Smith. So they had to develop systems to be able to get the mail to its intended recipients. And everyone after the war, troops regardless of race, talked about how important mail was for morale. And so this unit of black women are the ones who helped to maintain that morale by getting mail where it was supposed to go. So I mentioned earlier that during the war, none of the 433 Medals of Honor that were awarded went to black troops. Thankfully, in the 1990s, the Army conducted a review and promoted 7 black men who had received the Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. And I want to highlight 3 of those stories here. The first is Reuben Rivers. He was a 23-year-old tank platoon sergeant from Oklahoma. He fought through combat wounds and led several tank advances against German positions in northeastern France. He fought with the 761st Tank Battalion that was nicknamed the Black Panthers. They fought for 160 days consecutively through 4 major campaigns, including the Battle of the Bulge. If I had to vote for the most interesting person to serve in World War II, Edward Allen Carter Jr. would get my vote. He was raised by black missionary parents in India and China, and so he was fluent in Hindi, Mandarin, and German in addition to English. At 15, he left home to join the Chinese National Army to fight against Japanese incursions in Shanghai. He volunteered for the Spanish Civil War. He's one of those volunteers I mentioned earlier, and fought in that conflict. And all that's before he turned 21. And so in the summer of 1941, he volunteered for Army service. And you would think, with this combat experience and with this language skill, the Army would have a good role to give him. Instead, they assigned him to be a cook in a quartermaster unit, which I think speaks to the illogic of segregation. Segregation made no sense for a country that was trying to fight and win this global war. Right? It served no strategic or tactical purpose. Right? It wasted the talents of men like Edward Allen Carter Jr. Nevertheless, he served in that capacity until late 1944, when the Army was desperate for more frontline combat troops. He was one of 5,000 black men to volunteer for infantry duty just for the chance to be able to go to the front lines. He actually gave up his rank, went from being a staff sergeant back to being a private, just for the opportunity to see combat. I want to read to you from the commendation to give you a sense of what he did to earn the Medal of Honor. The morning of March 23rd, 1945, near Speyer, Germany, the tank upon which Carter was riding received bazooka and small arms fire from a large warehouse across a field. Carter volunteered to lead a 3-man patrol to the warehouse. Enemy small arms fire covered the field, killing one member of the patrol instantly. This caused Carter to order the other 2 members of the patrol to return to the cover position and cover him with rifle fire while he proceeded alone to carry out the mission. An enemy machine gun burst wounded Carter 3 times in the left arm as he continued the advance. Disregarding these wounds, Carter continued the advance by crawling until he was within 30 yards of his objective. The enemy fire became so heavy that Carter took cover behind a bank and remained there for approximately 2 hours. 8 enemy riflemen approached Carter, apparently to take him prisoner, but Carter popped up, shot 6 of the enemy soldiers, and captured the remaining 2. And I mentioned earlier he was fluent in German, so he interrogates these 2 troops that he captured in German as he's leading them back across the field, getting valuable intelligence about where the rest of the troops, the Nazi troops, are stationed, thereby saving the lives of men in his own unit. It sounds like Hollywood movie stuff, but Carter actually did it. The last person I'll mention here is Vernon Baker Jr. He was the only one still alive to receive the Medal of Honor in person. And initially, when he got the call from the White House, he didn't want to go. He said, "I performed these actions 5 decades ago. You should have honored me then rather than now." But eventually, he did choose to accept the award. During the war, he was a first lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry. He took out 3 machine gun positions and led a battalion charge through heavy fire and enemy minefields to help the Allies capture a German mountain stronghold in Italy in April of 1945. One of my favorite quotes in the book comes from Baker. He said, "I was an angry young man. We were all angry. We had a job to do, and we did it." And I think that speaks to the reality of what a lot of Black Americans experienced in the service of their country during World War II. They were upset about the conditions they served under. They were upset about the racism, upset about the discrimination, upset about the hypocrisy, and yet they gave everything they could to help our country win the war. And I think that's a tremendous story of patriotism that deserves to be remembered. The third and final argument the book makes is that for Black Americans, the war did not end in 1945. Yes, the military battles were complete, but there was still a battle for civil rights here at home. In the words of one Black veteran, they went from fighting in the European theater of operations to fighting in the Southern theater of operations. To give you a sense of what they're fighting against, this is Senator James O. Eastland on the floor of the Senate in the summer of 1945. Eastland said, "Negro soldiers have disgraced the flag of their country. The Negro race is an inferior race. I'm proud that the purest form of white blood flows in my veins. I know that the white race is a superior race. It has ruled the world. It has given us civilization. It's responsible for all of the progress on Earth." Now, if these words are upsetting to us today, and they should be, imagine how they sounded to Black veterans who just risked their lives, seeing their buddies killed, fighting for a country that treated them as half American. They're outraged by this. They're also outraged because they recognize that Mississippi was not a functioning democracy. When Eastland's speaking these words, the population of Mississippi is 48% Black. But fewer than 2% of Black Mississippians are registered to vote because of decades of intentional voter disenfranchisement, in some cases violence and murder to keep Black people from the polls. If Mississippi was actually a democracy, someone like James O. Eastland with these distorted racial views would never be representing a state that was nearly half Black. Black people at the time recognized that, and they recognized how unfair it was to have someone like this in a position of power. I think it's also important for us to sit with the kind of racist vitriol he felt emboldened to share. This isn't someone posting anonymously to a website, or in this era, writing a letter to a newspaper, or scribbling down some notes. This is one of the most powerful men in Washington, D.C., spouting some of the most hate-filled rhetoric we can imagine on the floor of the Senate. There was nothing abstract about white supremacy or racial discrimination, racial hierarchies in 1945. I think when we think back at the war and what the war meant and what people were fighting against after the war, this is part of the story we have to tell. Part of why this is important is that the GI Bill legislation that was being drafted in 1940 and 45 went through committees that were controlled by Southern segregationists who had views like James O. Eastland. Taking a step back, I think most people are familiar with the GI Bill, but it's one of the most important pieces of legislation of the 20th century. It provided access to low-interest home mortgages, access to college tuition benefits, access to loans to be able to start businesses. So it made it possible for a whole generation of white veterans to be able to move into the middle class. But as legislation is being drafted, it goes to these committees dominated by Southern segregationists, and they make sure the legislation is going to be distributed, the benefits will be distributed at the state and local level rather than at the federal level. And everyone at the time understands what that means. If you do things at the state level in 1945, it means you're deferring to the prejudices and policies of different states, including those southern states. And so black veterans, by and large, weren't able to access their GI Bill benefits in the same way white veterans were. And that discrimination was by design. To give you a sense of what that looked like, in Mississippi, only 2 of more than 3,000 VA guaranteed home loans issued in 1947 went to black borrowers. And things weren't much better up north. Out of 67,000 mortgages insured by the VA in New York and New Jersey that year, fewer than 100 went to blacks. Nationally, by 1950, white veterans had received nearly 98% of VA guaranteed loans. There's a group of economists at Brandeis University. They're trying to calculate the long-term impact of this discrimination. And what they found is, on average, black World War II veterans received about $100,000 less from the GI Bill than white veterans did. And so we think about the vast racial wealth gap we have in the country today. A good portion of it can be traced back to the GI Bill and the kind of discrimination that was written into it. I should also mention, though, that there were thousands of black veterans who were able to access the GI Bill. And they did amazing things with it, just like white veterans did. They went to college, they became architects, lawyers, and doctors. And so part of the story we have to tell about the GI Bill is not just the discrimination, opportunity cost to our country. That had there not been this discrimination, there would have been a much larger generation of black professionals coming out of World War II. Because we know the black veterans who could access it did amazing things. There just weren't enough of them who could access it. One of the other battles black veterans were fighting when they came home was just the battle for their daily lives. The hardest chapter of the book for me to write was a chapter called Homecoming, where I described the violence that black veterans encountered when they came back to the United States. There are at least a dozen black veterans who were attacked or murdered in the years after World War II. I'll highlight 4 of their stories here. Eugene Bell was the father of 2 young children. He was abducted and killed by a band of white men in Liberty, Mississippi. The attack was retaliation because when Bell was honorably discharged from the Army, he went to work for his father-in-law rather than returning as a sharecropper on a white-owned farm. John C. Jones was honorably discharged as an Army corporal. He was lynched by a white gang in Minden, Louisiana, for allegedly sneaking into a white family's backyard. The Pittsburgh Courier editors wrote, "Another veteran of World War II who emerged unscathed from the Holocaust has been done to death on his native soil and has gone unavenged." Maceo Snipes was an Army veteran. He was confronted by 4 KKK members who came to his farmhouse the day after he became the first black person to vote in a Democratic primary in Taylor County, Georgia. Snipes was shot and killed by Edward Williamson, who was also a World War II veteran. George Dorsey, who served in the Pacific, had been home for less than a year when he, his wife Mae Murray, and their friends Dorothy and Roger Malcolm were shot 60 times at close range by a white mob in Walton County, Georgia. Dorsey's white landlord, who was implicated in the shooting but never charged, later said, "Up until George went in the Army, he was a good boy. But when he came out, they thought they were as good as white people." This violence against veterans was about power. It was about intimidation. And more than anything else, it was about what kind of country America was going to be after World War II. And this galvanized black people all across the country. One of the first published pieces of writing we have from Martin Luther King Jr. was a letter he wrote to an Atlanta newspaper in 1946, describing his outrage at some of these killings. He said, "We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens." So that's what the Double Victory campaign was about. Black men and women gave everything they could to the military effort, and they were happy, as the rest of the country was, when the war ended in 1945. But they came home and needed to keep fighting for actual freedom and democracy here in the United States. And so there were hundreds of black Americans that became part of the civil rights movement. Most famously, Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was just 19 years old when his unit landed on Omaha Beach, just days after the D-Day invasion. He was part of that Red Ball Express I mentioned earlier. He loaded cargo for those black truck drivers. He described his experience in France as being the first time he ever felt like he was treated as a full human being by a white person. And so it really opened up his eyes to the kinds of differences that might be possible in the future. It was entirely unlike what he experienced in Mississippi. In 1946, on his 21st birthday, he tried to lead a group of black veterans to register to vote in Decatur, Mississippi, in his hometown, only to be turned away by a white mob with guns. He said, "I had been in Omaha Beach. All we black soldiers wanted was to be ordinary citizens. We fought during the war for America, Mississippi included. Now, after the Germans and Japanese hadn't killed us, it looked as though white Mississippians would. Evers dedicated his life to fighting for civil rights, took on increasingly important roles in the NAACP over the course of the 1950s. He helped investigate the lynching of Emmett Till and kept fighting for voting rights and civil rights until he was assassinated in 1963. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. There are dozens of other people I could mention here. I'll highlight just 3 more. Hosea Williams lied about his age to join the Army at 16. After the war, he came back and was nearly killed in Savannah, Georgia for drinking from a white-only water fountain. He went on to co-lead the Southern Christian Leadership Conference alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. W. Johnson Roundtree served in the Women's Army Corps. She used the GI Bill to earn a law degree from Howard University Law School, and then opened up a pioneering law firm in Washington, D.C. that won a number of important civil rights cases. And Amzie Moore served in the Army. He was originally from Mississippi, came back to Mississippi and became an important grassroots activist fighting for voting rights. The last person I want to mention is a man named Robert P. Madison. Mr. Madison paused his architectural studies at Howard University to serve as a second lieutenant in the 92nd Infantry Division during the war, where he earned a Purple Heart in combat in Italy. After the war, he earned architectural degrees from Case Western and Harvard before returning to his hometown of Cleveland to establish a trailblazing architectural firm. He worked on dozens of buildings, including the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. One of the sources I drew on for the book were dozens of interviews that the National World War II Museum in New Orleans has conducted with veterans, including black veterans. And so I want to play a clip of the interview with Mr. Madison, where he describes an experience of going to a bookstore.
Museum, yes, no question in my mind about that. The sad thing about it, though, is that the black troops were not represented at all. I was passing through the bookstore the other day, and I saw this great big volume called World War II, and I didn't see one reference to any black soldiers or any black airmen at all in the book. The book was that thick. And I said, we were a forgotten group of people. So I think there should be this museum, and I think it ought to show and represent everybody who fought in that war. And those who, when I say fight, I don't mean were in battle, but who supported it, who were the ordnance, who were the quartermaster corps, who were the cooks, who were all that sort of thing. It ought to be there, because that is a record. That's our history. Yes, I do believe so.
It's the part where he says, we were a forgotten group of people. That really stuck with me. It's one of the reasons I wrote Half American. I wrote it for men and women like Robert Madison, who served the country, but whose service hasn't been honored and respected in the way that it should be. I'm grateful that I had a chance to actually meet Mr. Madison a couple years ago in person. I was in Cleveland receiving a book award, and he was able to come. And so I want to play the final clip of me having a chance to acknowledge him for the crowd there in Cleveland.
I want to start by telling you the thing I tell my students in the classroom all the time. The stories we tell about the past matter. Today, there are fewer than 120,000 living American World War II veterans, including approximately 10,000 black veterans. I'd like to start by talking about one of them, who happens to be a Clevelander, and who happens to be here with us this evening, Robert P. Madison.
I love the shrug he gives at the end. So Mr. Madison was 100 years old when I had a chance to meet him. He's 101 today, still alive. I try to convince my students of this all the time, that this history is not that long ago. Right? This is still in the living memory of people who are with us today, and certainly in the living memory of people who are our parents and our grandparents. It's part of why it's so important to reckon honestly with this history. Not the mythical history of the good war fought by the greatest generation, but the actual history of how it actually unfolded. Because we can take lessons and learn lessons from that history that can help us as we try to navigate the country we're living in today and the country we want to try to build in the future. Let me close by reading you the last paragraph of the book. The stories we tell about the past matter. Stories of World War II that do not reckon with the black American experience leave us ill-prepared to understand the present and rudderless as we try to navigate the future. Ignorant Ignorance is a luxury that we cannot afford. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can meet the resurgence of explicit racism as a deeply entrenched aspect of our country's political history and cultural life, rather than as a surprise or an anomaly. If we tell the right stories about the war, we can see modern battles over voting rights and racial justice as a continuation of decades-long struggles to make America an actual functioning democracy. And if we tell the right stories about the war, we can finally honor the sacrifices of the Black veterans, defense industry workers, and citizens who fought on foreign battlefields in their own cities and towns so that no one would ever again be treated as half American. Thank you.
As always, we have an opportunity to ask some questions of Dr. Delmont. I do want to just point out one thing. You mentioned the Red Ball Express. If you've seen our Minnesota's Greatest Generation exhibit, you can see the combat boots of Technical Sergeant John Brown, who was an African-American soldier on the Red Ball Express. And he also mentioned the 6888, Virginia Lee Frazier, a Minnesotan. You can read about her on Eminopedia. She was part of that unit and doing really amazing things, as he said, critical to the war effort. So it's nice to be able to see his presentation and see those Minnesota connections. But yes, we'll have Paul on that aisle and I'll be on this aisle. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll try to get to as many folks as we can.
Thank you very much. Although it was very different, do you think that, or do you have any evidence, any stories to support how Black veterans were treated after the Korean War? Certainly the Vietnam War is a whole nother, too many other influences, I think, to make a decent comparison, but the Korean War was shortly or closer to World War II. Any ideas?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I don't mention it here, I mention it in the book, but in 1948, President Truman signed an executive order that desegregated the military, or started the desegregation of the military. And so one of the differences between the Korean War and World War II is that you have units that are either have been desegregated or in the process of desegregating over the course of the war. There were more different roles and opportunities open to Black men and women in the service of the country during the Korean War. And so there's a slight oversimplification, but I'd say that the experience of Black men and women during the Korean War was better than it was in World War II, in part because the military had started to make adaptations. They recognized that segregation was antithetical to making a more efficient, successful military, which is not to say that racism wasn't still there in Korea, but you had more Black officers, you had more Black men in combat, you had integrated units, and so you didn't have as much explicit in-your-face racism as the men and women I write about in World War II.
Have you done research or work around Truman's Desegregation Act, and can you tell us about that?
Thanks for asking. So it wasn't the focus of my research, but I can speak a bit to it. So President Truman signed this executive order in 1948, and usually the thing I say about it is both a decade early and a decade late. The decade late is that people have been calling for this since the 1930s, African Americans had. Black Americans understood that they fought in every war the United States had ever been a part of. The American Revolution, the Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I. There were 300,000 Black Americans who served in World War I. And so in the lead up to World War II, you have Black newspaper editors, civil rights activists who are pushing for desegregation of the military. Because again, they're saying like there's no reason for this other than to denigrate us. Like there's no strategic or tactical reason for desegregation. So in a different political climate, one can imagine that desegregation happening in 1938, right? It didn't because military officials and politicians accurately recognized that enough white Americans would be dramatically upset about the desegregation of the military that they didn't feel like they had the political power to do it at the time. Thankfully, President Truman does sign the executive order in 1948. The influences that most historians cite, one is just political pressure. He recognizes that Black voters are going to be increasingly important to the Democratic Party, and he's willing to have that trade-off relative to the trade-off of losing the Democratic South, which he does. Right? The political realignment that we talk about sometimes in the country, where the South, white Southerners, had long been the core of the Democratic Party, that changes after 1948 with the desegregation of the military. Southerners break off into the Dixiecrats and sort of has that whole moment. The other thing that influenced Truman, he was a veteran himself, served in World War I. He was upset about the kind of violence that I talked about here. There's a case of a man named Isaac Woodard, who was beaten by a sheriff's baton in South Carolina. He was blinded. His eyes were gouged out. Received a huge amount of national attention. Orson Welles talked about Isaac Woodard's story on his radio program. Truman wrote letters and talked about how much that influenced him. He was outraged that this kind of violence was happening to black veterans. So that was part of it. And the third piece was that the after-action reports from the military talked about how black troops, by and large, performed really well. Right? I think that was part of getting the military over the hump of accepting desegregation. To Truman's credit, he signed this executive order, and then he holds people to account to actually get them to implement it. The initial Army commander who's in charge of the Army in 48 doesn't want to do anything about it. He drags his feet, and so Truman ousts him after 6 months. And so that was an impressive display of political will to make that happen. The last I'll say, the decade early part, is that it makes the military the first institution in American society to be meaningfully integrated. It comes before most corporations, most universities. It precedes the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And so I think the military does deserve a lot of credit for, after 1948, being the more forward-looking perspective with regards to racial integration.
Am I remembering correctly that Hubert Humphrey gave his speech, I think it was on the Senate floor, maybe it was at the nominating conference, about the importance of including people other than white people? He was well known for that. Did that happen before or after? Did it have any influence on Truman?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it.
It was the 48 Democratic Convention.
Okay.
Brown Truman marched out with his
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I would have to double check the timing of the dates. I know Truman establishes a committee to do a report that's called To Secure These Rights. It comes out in 1947, makes a bunch of recommendations. One of the few things he can do by himself is desegregate the military. And so I'd say the ball was rolling in 46, 47. But I think Humphrey's speech would have sort of been part of that larger moment of politicians choosing a side, essentially. And so I think he was on what I would certainly say was the right side of that decision.
First of all, thank you for all of the information you packed into your talk. I want to ask if you have information about the landing on the beach at Normandy. I was hoping, my question is, were there black troops among those, the huge number of troops that died on that landing? I'm interested in that.
Thank you for asking. I talk a bit more about it in the book, but on June 6th, D-Day itself, there were about 2,000 black troops that landed on the beaches of Normandy. There's the Barrage Balloon Battalion I mentioned. They landed and then immediately had to get their balloons up in the air, which was a really kind of complicated process because they had to read the weather reports and make sure things were flying correctly. There were drivers of amphibious trucks called ducks, these trucks that could go in the water and then go on land. That was a black unit. There were minesweepers who landed. I think of those 2,000, I don't know the precise number, but there would have been dozens who lost their lives alongside hundreds and hundreds of other American servicemen on that day. And so I think part of the story of D-Day is recognizing the black troops who were there, but then I think also understand the longer calendar, because there were still thousands and thousands of American troops that came across the channel on June 7th, June 8th, June 9th, and that's where you saw the much larger influx of black troops, the ones who would be driving the trucks, loading the cargo. They were baking bread, because you have to feed troops, right? So again, think about supplies, right? All these troops need more boots, they need ammunition, they need more clothes, they need food, and so black troops were doing a lot of that work. And so one of the things I read about in the book was there's a bread baking unit that was like 2 miles behind the front, preparing food to be able to serve to other troops. And so all of that is part of the larger black contribution to the war.
Are there any questions from our virtual audience? I want to make sure we don't forget them.
Yes, we do. Just a second. And they would like to ask, actually their comment, they just looked it up. Humphrey's speech to the 1948 convention was July 14. Truman signed the order desegregating the military on July 26. So, 8 days difference there?
Awesome.
There we go. Someone at home on their computer. That's helpful. So, yeah, we got a question in there.
Thanks so much. I learned that piece today. I appreciate it.
As you talked about the supply mechanism, in the United States, war workers, women, black women, white women, women across the nation were enlisted into industrial activity. And I'm wondering if in your research or in the chapters in your book, if you address that, and then the aftermath. Once the war is over, women return home, but things have changed. So would you say something about that?
Yeah, a great question. So it is a part of the book. In terms of the war work itself, part of it is, as I mentioned, is a story about opportunities, particularly for black women that hadn't been open previously. So definitely it's opportunities for all women, but particularly for black women, the work opportunities outside of the home were not numerous. And so these were incredibly important jobs, both for the pay, but for the respect that it provided. There are stories of women, there's huge migration during World War II, both black and white Americans, but in the case of black Americans, moving from the South to the Midwest or to California in pursuit of jobs. One quote that sticks in my head is, there's a woman who said, it was the war that got us out of white women's kitchens. And so that was a sort of nice kind of shorthand of like what these opportunities meant. But then as your question alludes to, those opportunities by and large end with the end of the war in 1945. As men come home, they get the chance to resume the jobs that they had left before the war. Women are by and large pushed back into former roles, either in the home or in domestic service. And so those opportunities weren't, in most cases, maintained.
This is probably a bit of a speculative question, but I'm taken by your presentation about the patriotism shown by the African Americans and also by the Native Americans as the two populations that seem to be the most willing to fight this war for a country that really treated them as if they were half American. Can you speak more as to where that motivation comes from? Because it seems to me, from my understanding of history, both these groups have played a role in practically all of our wars. They're very patriotic. To what? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. It's one my students ask all the time. So I didn't spend as much time on it here, but when you look at the kind of longer history of black American military service, one of the reasons Double Victory resonated so powerfully is that it was actually a reformulation of a very old idea. Frederick Douglass says very similar things about the Civil War. W.B. Du Bois says similar things about World War I, that if we provide military service, show patriotism and bravery, that will lead to advances in civil rights here in the United States. And so there's always this kind of twinning of the military service and more equality on the home front. In every case, though, the equality wasn't secured, right? So there was a backlash after the Civil War. There's a backlash after World War I. And so one of the things people were asking in World War II is this war going to actually be different? Right? We've seen this story before where we try to offer up our service to the country, but we haven't yet been treated as full citizens. Even moving ahead to the question about Vietnam, you see some of that same language there, right? In terms of what motivated black men and women to serve, some of it was a love of country. There were many people who had family members who had served previously and wanted to continue that tradition of service. Part of it was people were drafted and they had to serve. So there's that aspect of it. One of the reasons people fought for the opportunity to serve was that it brought opportunities with it. You had the chance to train for different professions that you might be able to use afterwards. You got a chance to travel the world. And for folks in the South, you got a chance to leave the South. Right? The conditions they experienced elsewhere were, in many cases, better. Kind of piggyback on what you asked about, one of the things that surprised me in the course of doing research, thinking about what it meant to serve in the country, was that we think about World War II as being a war where everyone really understood the stakes and why they were fighting. But when you actually go back and look at what people were saying in 1942, 43, in the public polling, it wasn't really clear for a lot of white Americans, particularly if they weren't Jewish, why the United States was fighting the war. People wanted revenge against Japan, but the sense of why we're fighting in Europe, there was a lot of, we don't know. Like, we don't know why we're there. Like, is this actually a war? What are we doing? Whereas for black Americans, that fight against fascism and the resonances they saw between the Nazi regime and Jim Crow segregation in the United States, there's more clarity of vision articulated in the Double Victory campaign than you saw for a lot of average white Americans who weren't Jewish. That I was certainly surprised by the kind of, like, what is this war in Europe? Like, why are we there? Which I think is a useful reminder that we write back a certain history on what the war was about later, once the horrors of the Holocaust become more apparent, once we start having stories about the good war, that seems like a really cut and dry, clear war. It wasn't clear to people in 1943 in the way that it is to us today.
Matt, I have another one from Zoom here. They say, I am familiar with a number of the deaths of returning black veterans who had dared to wear the uniform. Did the federal government consider or feel any obligation to protect these returning veterans?
Not in a significant way, is the short answer. This is something that was obviously an outrage to black people all across the country. They organized to try to fight against it, to try to get anti-lynching legislation passed, try to get federal authorities to do something about this meaningfully. And by and large, they were rebuffed. Most of these cases, and this continued into the 1960s even, many of the killings of black civil rights workers became cold cases. Sometimes killers were brought to justice, but in many cases they weren't. And so it's one of the most upsetting parts of the history to write about. It's why that chapter was so hard for me to write, is that you write these stories and realize that these people had risked their lives for the country and then came home and were killed here in the United States by their own countrymen. It's a really challenging, upsetting part of the history, but it's part of the larger story we have to tell about the war.
Thank you so much for your talk and also for the book. I teach history at Hamline University, and this is the third time I'll be teaching this book in a
Awesome,
U.S.
thank you.
history class. And I just want to say it's been very successful, eye-opening in all the ways that your talk has been for my students, but also so accessible. And it's been very successful with students. And I wanted to share that, but also to ask you about something that I read in an article. One of those times I was teaching the book, I think it was in Time magazine, where you wrote and observed that in light of some of the legislation in Texas, in Florida, and other places to limit what kinds of stories can be told in public and even private places. The story of Medgar Evers, for example, your book couldn't be taught. And I'm wondering both if you've heard back from instructors, teachers who've tried to teach this or other material on that kind of experience, and just generally if you have anything to say on that topic.
First off, thank you so much for teaching the book. I appreciate it. And, you know, as a historian, it's a really strange time to be a historian or an educator right now. New Hampshire is one of the states that has legislation passed regarding divisive concepts, is what they call it in New Hampshire, my current home state. I'm not famous enough for my book to have been banned, so I haven't heard about that. But I wrote the Time article because I think I do wonder the kinds of things I write about. I'm explicitly writing about white supremacy. I'm explicitly writing about discrimination. You can't talk about this history without talking about those concepts. And so I wonder if people are teaching the book at the junior high or high school level or in college, public institutions, whether there's a chilling effect that they'll feel less comfortable sharing some of these histories. And certainly my take is that this is our history, right? So I said at the outset, this is our shared history, that we have to be able to talk honestly about it. And if we don't, we lose sight of what the war was actually about. And I think from a different perspective, why wouldn't we want to talk about the contributions of black veterans, right? What kind of history would prevent us from teaching about Medgar Evers? Right? I think we lose so much of the story and so much of what it means to be patriotic, what it means to be American. And so I think the thing that worries me most about where a lot of these debates go is that it misunderstands what history's about, right? History isn't just meant to make us feel good. It's not just like greatest hits and things that make us happy, but it's a really complicated, messy thing, right? In the same way that things are complicated and messy today, they were complicated and messy in World War II. And if we're going to be serious about understanding the subject, we have to be able to deal with the nuances of it, the things that are inspiring but also are upsetting. And so I appreciate the question because it's something I try to wrestle with all the time. But it's part of why I'm so passionate about writing things like this, but then also trying to give presentations to share it with as many people as possible. Because I mean, we're obviously living in dynamic political times, but the things I write about in the book are true regardless of whether Trump's in the White House or Biden or Obama or Bush or whatever. Like, that's the thing that, like, I'm a boring person, right? I'm a historian who spends a lot of time trying to uncover these stories of the past, right? Like, I'm not trying to win political debates or like scream at people on cable TV, right? The goal of doing this work is it's serious, engaged scholarship to understand what happened, right? And where everyone falls in the political spectrum, if you want to understand World War II, you have to be able to think about these things and then figure out how does this help us understand where we are today.
We've got, I think, a couple more questions here. So, yes, I think that definitely deserves applause. And thank you for being boring and not wanting to scream at people on cable news.
So I want to be sure that you know that the museum has, in their shop, they have T-shirts that says, "History Matters." You might want to buy one and wear it for a lecture. and then the second, this is quick. A friend of mine who teaches history, we've wondered if there's any book or any printed material that surveys the different ways that American history has been taught over the decades. Just because it's important and it has varied a lot.
It's a great question, and thanks for mentioning the T-shirt. It sounds awesome. I can't think of the person's name right now. There's a historian at Stanford University that works on teacher education and the history of education. He has projects on how history has been taught at different points in time. But it is a fascinating thing. And one challenge of teaching history is there's so much there, right? So I have the utmost respect for my colleagues who work at the high school level because you're trying to cram so much history into a semester to 2 terms, right? And so I would never say, like, oh, if you don't talk about things in this detail, like you can't do it in this detail, even in a college survey class. But the point is, whatever you're talking about, there's always so much more you can point students to or point educated adults like yourselves to learn more about these different aspects. And that's what's so fun about history. There's always more for us to learn.
Thank you. Your point kind of triggered a thought for me about high school history, and you were addressing that. And it would be interesting to find out how students have been taught history over time. It seems like over time we learn more, and hopefully more of that gets incorporated into what we teach. So I'm hoping that at the high school level for American history, some of this information during a World War II, topic would be included. I guess is the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, absolutely. The Black Quotidian Project I mentioned earlier, it has a bit on the teaching of Black history. I mean, one of the things I think is really important is that they did a survey of Americans a few years ago and asked, who do you consider to be the most iconic American, not counting presidents? And the top 2 people mentioned were Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. Right? It's impossible to think that we would have gotten there without Black History Month. Right? That once that became part of the educational system, those just became common names. On the education front, I'm grateful that I teach at Dartmouth. It's a well-resourced institution. So I've been able to use some of the funds I have at Dartmouth to be able to provide, at this point, 14,000 copies of the book to high school teachers and students all across the country through the Zinn Education Project to try to give teachers more resources to be able to teach the book in new ways.
I think we have time for one more question. And then if you do have other questions, Dr. Delmont will be available for book signings out in the rotunda after.
It's a comment, not a question, and I'm going to put you on the spot. I thought last year in the forum series there was a speaker who did do work on curriculum and manifest destiny and went into textbooks.
Yes, so that was Donald Iacovone, whose book Teaching White Supremacy. It was not part of the forum, but it was similar. But yes, that's actually available recording if you want to watch it on our YouTube channel. If you didn't catch it, he looks at the history of teaching American history and the ways that white supremacy ideologies have been woven into that for decades and decades and decades. So he did a review of textbooks. It's very fascinating work. So I encourage you to check that out if you haven't. But with that, please join me in thanking Dr. Delmont for a wonderful presentation.